Listen, I'm not much of a music critic. I love music, I listen to a lot of music, but I'm not good at articulating why I love listening to music. But that doesn't really matter, because the quality of music is subjective, and I can set my own definitions of what makes an album good or bad. So let's do a little thought experiment. Let's forget about songwriting, lyrics, production, or any other tangible parts of the listening experience, and let's boil down the concept of good music to its simplest, purest form. What album brings me the most happiness? Now, I think this approach is interesting because it focuses entirely on the merits of the listening experience. Even if an album is terrible, just an absolute trash fire by all objective standards, it can still be a worthwhile use of your time. And that brings me to the album I want to talk about in this video. Because even if the album in question is an unpolished, unrehearsed wreck that completely misses the mark on what it's trying to achieve, I can honestly say that no album has ever brought me as much joy as Tiny Tim Rock. Throughout the years, many bands and artists have been accused of compromising their artistic integrity to chase greater commercial success. In other words, selling out. This is regarded as a big no-no in most of music culture, with it being especially heinous within harder genres of music like metal and punk.
By the way, did you know that some of our stores are actually open all night?
No, Kiss, what about your integrity? No! But you know, I don't blame any bands for going commercial. The music industry is a hard place to survive, especially now. And sometimes you gotta do what's right for the bank account. But one of my favorite musical oddities is when an artist is physically incapable of selling out. They desperately try to make their music appeal to modern crowds, but they are so removed from the pop music zeitgeist that the end result is a baffling, incomprehensible mess with zero commercial appeal. Now, this doesn't happen often, but I'd argue Tiny Tim Rock is one of the more blatant examples. This is Tiny Tim selling out, and he is so goddamn bad at it. The album itself is a 76-minute long covers album, featuring 5 rock and roll hits handpicked by Tiny Tim himself. Now, on its own, the tracklist is fairly sane. However, that's until you see the runtimes, and then you realize that this fucker quintupled the runtime for Rebel Yell. And then you realize that's not even the longest song on the album. This record is captivating, car crash fascinating, and I want to talk about it. But to really understand this album, we first need to understand the man behind it.
Right. And what is that you're carrying in your hand there, Tiny?
Well, it's my little shopping bag and the ukulele.
Oh, right.
Tiny Tim is such a fascinating character, man. Originally, I was just going to give a brief summary of the man's life, but the more I learned about him, the more infatuated I became. And he started taking up more and more space in the video. And really, Tiny's story is one I think deserves to be told. So, strap yourselves in, folks, because here's the story of Tiny Tim and the greatest album of all time. Herbert Buttress Corey was born in Manhattan in 1932. He was generally thought of as a strange boy, often teased by the other kids, and he spent a lot of time alone.
I feel like someone from Mars coming to Earth when I see these people.
He had an early fondness for music, usually spending hours a day in front of his 78 gramophone. He would eventually begin performing music himself, and after a dead-end venture as a pianist, he taught himself how to sing and play the ukulele. He was also a musical archivist, often visiting his local libraries and preserving forgotten songs from decades ago.
Where do you come up with your songs? Where do you find them?
The New York Public Library at Lincoln Center, I don't know if any one of your listeners know this, it's available. They have over 7 million songs.
The man was described as a living music encyclopedia, having a savant level of recollection when it came to old songs. Herbert was able to remember the song titles, the artists, the names of everyone in the band, the publisher, the year, and even the matrix number of thousands of records. While not pursuing his musical passion, Herbert worked a number of odd jobs, usually getting fired after only a few days. Unable to find paying music gigs, Herbert started joining local talent contests, without much success. That was until one day, while singing The Old Ferris Wheel, he discovered his falsetto voice, which would become a staple in his signature vocal repertoire. He also started work on his aesthetic style, applying heavy amounts of makeup and growing his hair out way longer than what was acceptable in the 50s. With his new image and voice assembled, he started absolutely dominating the talent show circuit. And this eventually landed Herbert his first paying music gig at the local freak show. Yeah, while Herbert was gaining a lot of attention, it was a lot of negative attention. Herbert was generally seen as a creepy misfit, and the people who came to watch him didn't do so out of genuine musical appreciation, but rather to gawk at him. His effeminate way of presenting himself also meant that he was harassed on the regular.
Not really an astronaut, Mr. Cabot. I've always been... Back to the early 50s.
Right.
I was one of the first to use, they called me Sissy, but back in 1952.
I can't believe they would call you that.
Yeah.
Despite the huge resistance, however, Herbert soldiered on, and soon enough he found a more genuine and receptive audience. Herbert eventually left the freak show life behind, and started playing more oddball clubs and cafes. However, there was one serious problem he had to deal with before his career could really take hold, which is that Herbert is not a very sexy name. In search for a new stage name, he originally settled on Vernon Castle. That was already taken. All in all, Herbert ended up experimenting with many names in the early 60s.
Right.
Well, I had other names besides Tiny Tim.
Did you really? What were your other names?
Larry Love, Gary Dover, Emmett Swink, Raleigh Dell.
Yeah, somebody was telling me the other day that when you were Larry Love, you used to be in like this freak show.
That's very true.
In 1962, Herbert was actually offered a record deal as Gary Dover and the White Cliffs. The album would feature Herbert and a large-scale backing band. However, this would not be his big breakthrough, as Herbert sabotaged the album by purposefully singing off-key, and the album was shelved. In 1963, his manager billed him as Sir Timothy Timms and wanted him to perform in a British accent. After it turned out that his British accent was terrible, his name was whittled down to Tiny Tim, a nod to the classic Dickens character, as well as a rather ironic nickname considering Tiny's relatively large stature. In 1964, Tiny Tim was paired up with legendary comedian Lenny Bruce, and the two became good friends. At this point, Tiny was starting to rub elbows with the great up-and-comers of rock and roll. He even played one-off gigs with the Rolling Stones and Les Paul, the man. That being said, while Tiny was getting a lot of powerful musician friends, he was still flat broke and living with his parents at age 32. Though his connections to the industry proved fruitful, and in 1966, Tiny had yet another chance at recording an album. Backed by a 40-piece band, this album set out to recreate the feel of Tiny's live performances.
It's raining violets and where you see clouds.
The album was never released. In 1967, as part of the movie You Are What You Eat, Tiny recorded with the band of Woodstock fame. While the group took a liking to him, they found him very difficult to work with. For one, Tiny had real trouble keeping up with the band's accompaniment, with his sense of timing being odd and clumsy. They also grew tired of Tiny's many quirks. You see, Tiny is often thought of to have both obsessive-compulsive disorder and autistic spectrum disorder, and part of that is due to his obsession with cleanliness and cleanliness products. He would often spend hours at his local supermarkets looking at various soaps, creams, and cleansers.
Well, this country's been blessed not only with wonderful things, but great supermarkets.
Yes.
I mean, great products. They really care about the products.
Tiny also showered 5 times a day, including showering after every bathroom break. That, combined with an intense disdain towards public bathrooms, meant that every time Tiny needed to use the bathroom, he would simply walk home, with each break taking about an hour. He also had a very specific diet, usually limiting himself to very specific foods. At this time, the dude lived on a diet of almost purely Popeye's spinach, and by 1967, Tiny had reverted to a strict vegetarian diet consisting of onions, bananas, sunflower seeds, and honey.
I mean, dude, Tiny was on a thing for a while that he was just eating pumpkin seeds and ragu.
Right, yeah,
I mean, that was the whole thing. Now he's into raw apples and prunes.
And he didn't cook the spaghetti, remember?
Remember, you used to eat regular spaghetti?
In 1967, Tiny would finally see his big break One night, while performing at The Scene, Tiny was offered a contract at Reprise Records, a label founded by Frank Sinatra himself. And so, that November, Tiny Tim was airlifted to California to make another album, this time with a $25,000 budget and major label backing. The album in question was God Bless Tiny Tim.
Welcome to my dream, and how are you?
Half contemporary new material, half obscure oldies that Tiny had been performing for decades, including a cover of The Doors' classic People Are Strange, which was handpicked by Jim Morrison himself, though sadly not included in the final release. The album also featured Tiny's signature hit, Tiptoe Through the Tulips.
Tiptoe through the window, by the window, that is where all become tiptoe.
God Bless Tiny Tim sold 100,000 copies on its first week, and Tiptoe Through the Tulips would eventually reach number 17 on the Billboard single chart. But these numbers, while pretty good for the time, do not convey how much of a phenomenon this guy was, because Tiny Tim's infamy is not a result of chart success, but rather television success. And it would all start with his appearance at Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In.
A tisket, a green and yellow biscuit. I sent a letter to my mother on the way.
This appearance was a huge boost for Tiny, and it kickstarted his relationship with national television. From this point on, he would be booked for talk show appearances for years, each time to great audience response.
You shake my nerves and you rattle my brain. Loving drives a man insane.
I really believe that there's life on every planet with the exception of the sun, and that's a maybe. Because,
May I ask you for the telephone number of your singing teacher? I want to take lessons.
The best talents are untaught, Preminger.
Of course, with our modern, more cynical eyes, it's easy to get the impression that Tiny's stardom was a result of nationwide ridicule, that Tiny Tim was someone people laughed at, not with. And for a lot of people, that was the case.
The Tiny Tim image is not one that people rejoice over. The emotion of negativity was so emotional that they had to be there. I was the one they loved to hate.
But really, the Tiny Tim appreciators came in two colors. There were those who took him for a clown, a funny novelty act as that weird guy with the high voice on the TV. And then there were those who recognized him as a genuine and utterly unique musician, who paved his unlikely way to success entirely on his own unorthodox terms. In fact, Tiny was given immense support from pretty much all of the biggest stars in his day.
Play Tiny Tim, gentle readers. Tiptoe Through the Tulips.
It's a funny joke at first, but it's not really.
He's
real.
Tiny Tim for president or Tiny Tim for queen.
Almost overnight, the world discovered Tiny Tim in tandem, and he was now a bona fide superstar with superstar responsibilities. Tiny actually gained a huge female audience, being featured prominently in teen girl magazines. This led to Tiny getting a lot of groupie attention, which, as a strict Catholic, was more temptation than he could shoulder alone. On May 28th, a man named Gary Green was officially placed on Tiny Tim's payroll at $100 a week, with the exclusive job of deterring Tiny Tim from sinning.
God bless Mr. Green.
Tiny wrote,
I pray for the hard job he has.
Groupies wasn't the only problem fame had brought him. Despite immense commercial success, Tiny was often just breaking even. Now, part of that was a strict controlling management taking a big cut of his revenue.
Well, the honest truth is that I only got $100 a week allowance. They kept me at the Sunset Marquis Hotel. They sent maybe about $300 a month to my parents, and the rest, sometimes they covered the amount so I wouldn't tell the press.
But a lot of the fault also lied with Tiny himself and his complete lack of impulse control. Tiny would spend an inordinate amount of money on luxurious room service, records, instruments. In fact, he would often spend hundreds of dollars on tips to service staff a day. In a desperate attempt to curb Tiny's spending, his managers gave him a spending salary of $100 a week and gave strict orders for the hotels they frequented to never indulge Tiny's room service calls. Tiny responded by impersonating his manager's voice on the phone and ordering 31 bottles of champagne to his room. This sort of spending would bankrupt almost any mortal man, but thankfully for Tiny, his career was going really well. While his records and singles didn't sell as well as projected, his live performances were legendary, performing at the Royal Albert Hall and the White Festival in front of tens and thousands of fans. But maybe most enduring of all were his many talk show appearances. During the late 60s, Tiny would frequent many talk shows, maybe most notably The Late Show with Johnny Carson.
Doctor, I've got to see a doctor because there's something wrong with me. What can it be?
These appearances boosted his career to even greater heights, and the best was yet to come.
We'll love each other dear,
While attending a book signing for his book Beautiful Thoughts, Tiny met a girl named Vicky Budinger, and Tiny instantly became obsessed with her. He tracked her down through magazine ads, and the two eventually started dating. Despite a rocky start, the two developed a budding relationship, despite Vicky being 17 and Tiny being 37. Tiny's mother insisted she was too young for him. Her words had no effect. "I like young girls," he replied. The couple would appear together at The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, where Tiny Tim would give Miss Vicky his engagement ring, to much applause. Carson jokingly asked if they would get married on the show too, to which Tiny replied, "Yes."
As a very casual remark, Johnny said, "Well, why don't you get married on the show?" Never meaning it, just saying it as a thing. Why don't you get married on the show? That became a thing.
Despite some immediate doubts, the wedding went off as planned, and the pair got married on The Tonight Show on the 17th of December, 1969.
The Lord bless thee and keep thee this day and unto the end.
Now at the time, this was a huge moment in television history. How huge? Well, based on the ratings of The Tonight Show, Tiny's wedding was the second most watched event in television history at the time. Second only to, yeah, that's right, the moon landing. Yeah, this was huge. Cities in the US even reported a marked drop in crime and traffic, and some cities even experienced brownouts due to electricity companies not being able to keep up with the demand. Carson himself would never break the record set by this night until his very last episode in 1992. This was truly the height of Tiny's brush with fame. He was one of the biggest stars in America, at the peak of his career. But sadly, there is only one way to go after a peak.
I'd love to see Christ come back to crush the spirit of hate and make men put down their guns. I'd also like just one more hit single.
While Tiny was still immensely popular, the truth is he was borderline bankrupt, and his albums and singles consistently underperformed. Intoxicated by fame, he began making very perplexing career decisions, including getting increasingly political in his television appearances. Yeah, contrary to his teeny bop-friendly persona, Tiny's view on women was outdated even by the standards of the 1960s.
Women, in my opinion, have no sense of humor.
Woman is the second choice. Her duties were to take care of the home and scrub the floor and raise the children. Today, she has free will to go against nature, to go out and vote, to compete for a job.
He was also a firm supporter of America's role in the Vietnam War, which was very unpopular at the time. In fact, in 1970, in an attempt to score another hit single, he recorded a 55-year-old World War I ditty called "Don't Bite the Hand That's Feeding You," urging those who didn't support America's role in the war to go back to their country, whatever it's called.
And go back to your home or the sea, to the land from where you came, whatever be its name.
It didn't chart. But despite the lack of record success, Tiny continued to coast on his marriage momentum. Toys were made, posters were printed, sheet music was published bearing his likeness. He even got his own board game.
So, what's all this about?
It's a lovely game for the nice kiddies.
I see. And what about the nasty kiddies?
They can play it too.
He continued touring the country and appearing on talk shows, but with his spending unchecked, he was still flat broke. His television marriage was also taking quite a hit, and the relationship between Tiny and Miss Vicky would be rocky and uneasy, effectively ending in 1974, though not officially divorcing until 5 years later.
This meant that I didn't believe in cheating. I didn't believe in anything of fooling around. She was fooling around with me in 71. She left me in 72 with a male model.
By this time, Tiny's life and career were in shambles, but his resolve was strong and he was determined to make it back onto the charts. Tiny's first attempt at a comeback was the new Tiny Tim Show, touring in 1974. This was sort of a reimagining of the Tiny Tim brand, presenting it more as a straight-laced and mature character.
I knocked on doors and I sang my songs, and each day they'd say, hey, go away and don't come back.
The new Tiny Tim Show went okay. It scored him a few talk show appearances where he would talk about Jesus and his disdain for women's rights, and soon afterwards the attention once again fizzled out. By late 1974, Tiny Tim was out of money and officially homeless, and he resolved to move back in with his mother in New York City.
You're always a baby to mother. She never stops caring for you. Even though years have passed since you played with each toy, she'll kiss you and call you her own baby boy when everyone else has forgotten.
In the mid-70s, Tiny would continue to play seedy nightclubs and cafes. Desperate for any way to claw back on top, he began work on another comeback. After a few dead-end singles, his ideas to climb the charts became more and more elaborate. In fact, one of his ideas was to harvest the musical distributory powers of pornography. Tiny believed that a porno film was the perfect vehicle for introducing the public to his serious singing style, and planned to juxtapose his nude scenes against a soundtrack featuring his versions of standards.
We have the world at our feet in this generation today, which is only buying these types of movies. People would look at this movie and say, hey, as bad as this movie is, this guy can sing.
Well, this is a very important subject for us to dwell on, don't you think?
Well, it could be a mighty important subject for anyone to dwell on.
This unique style of distribution was ultimately never realized. However, in 1978, he would receive a lucky break. Australian artist Martin Sharp, who had first seen Tiny perform at Royal Albert Hall, was obsessed with the man, and in 1978 he invited Tiny to Australia to perform, as well as record new material.
This is Mr. Carlton here, and he wants to know how the weather is in Australia now.
And in early 1979, work began on 2 new albums. The first, Chameleon, was a mixture of old standard tunes, as well as recent pop and rock songs with a classic Tiny Tim flair. The second, World of Romance, was a collection of love songs from his favorite crooners, done in entirely 2 takes, one for side A and one for side B. This was a particular challenge for the band, as Tiny kept missing his cues and kept adding and skipping beats at will.
Whoa. We've lost ourselves, we've lost the track.
To combat this, the instrumental accompaniment was generally kept to a minimum.
Say you never know when it may say hello in a very unexpected place.
He was also advised to rely less on his falsetto voice, since his now almost 50-year-old vocal cords were starting to toughen up around the edges. The 2 albums would both be released in 1980 in 400 and 200 copies respectively. This meant that the albums actually lost quite a bit of money in total. But this was never really meant as a commercial venture anyway, at least for Martin Sharp, who would ultimately spend millions of dollars funding Tiny Tim related projects. But even amidst all this commercial turmoil, Tiny would again have a brief stint with national television.
Let's get down to this pond. Fill her up. Give me all you've got till I scream I've had enough.
In 1979, Tiny released a new single, Tiptoe to the Gas Pumps, to coincide with the 1979 oil crisis. It surprisingly tangented the charts, reaching number 80 on the Billboard charts and awarding him a handful of Nitro appearances, including an invitation back to The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. this ultimately did not do him any good, and further cemented Tiny's reputation as a washed-up novelty. He would never appear on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson ever again.
But I just completed my first horror movie, full-length movie, called Blood Harvest. And that is really a restricted horror movie where I play a mad, insane clown. Well, listen.
The 80s were not a good decade for Tiny. He started off by releasing his single, Yummy Yummy Pizza, oh oh oh, those landlords, supposedly being given out by a New York pizza chain.
Yum, 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 that's the pizza pie for me. Yum, 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 come, 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 come.
Other than that, he still kept on doing gigs and releasing the odd, ill-fated single, including a cover of AC/DC's Highway to Hell, and maybe more controversially, Santa Claus has got the AIDS this year. Neither of these had any commercial viability. Unable to sustain his career independently and in need of stable income, Tiny Tim joined the local circus.
So other has-beens beside myself, like Pat Boone, can now join the circus and make a comeback with their careers.
While he always took care to speak of the circus with respect, it was a far cry from the lofty heights of Royal Albert Hall.
With this great group and with these great artists who really can sing and put on a show, really it's not bad for a street singer of the 50s.
There must be changes in my career. I must make it in records, movies, or television. Or not at all.
In the midst of this, he was also experiencing vocal problems, especially in regards to his falsetto voice. Each day, he only managed a few minutes of solid falsetto before losing it, whereupon they would stop recording vocals and resume the next day. He believed that cold air helped keep his falsetto intact, and ate copious amounts of white Tic Tacs and drank Slurpees during the sessions.
How would you describe your voice?
Like the dollar floating. I mean, it's sometimes it's there, some days it's somewhere else.
As the 1980s went on, Tiny became more and more unhinged, isolated, and depressed. He had moved to Des Moines, Iowa, where he lived in a hotel room. Broke, divorced, and lonely, he spent his days watching sermons on television, buying scratch-offs, performing the odd gig to make the ends meet, and eating the same foods he had always eaten.
The spinach, the Del Monte spinach is wonderful, and the green giant asparagus go right from the can, drink the water with it.
Mm-hmm. Why do you not cook it?
I don't like a hot spinach.
In 1991, Mike Panera and Tiny embarked on what would be their last tour together. Tiny was now 59 years old, and the years of constant traveling were taking a toll on his health. At the outset of the tour, Tiny shared a startling prediction. "I probably don't have much longer on the planet. The good Lord above us is calling me home. I will be on stage, singing Tiptoe Through the Tulips with my shoes on and my ukulele in hand. I will be performing when it happens." He would soon be diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, which he had left untreated for over a decade. This was probably a result of his poor dietary choices, which had become more and more unhealthy as time went on.
I like pizza pies. I don't want nothing from these commercials. Only buy Domino's.
At this point, Tiny's diet reportedly consisted mainly of fatty fast food, raw potatoes, and beer.
Oh, I'll say. But I tell you, I will not blame the beers. They were great beers. They were fantastic beers.
Will you continue to drink these beers?
Of course.
You will.
I've got to watch the diabetes, Tiny said. But praise the Lord, they can take off my leg. I'd rather have the beer. Still, Tiny refused to give up without a fight.
As long as I can sing, I will keep trying to make it one more time.
So when Martin Sharp once again invited Tiny to Australia, this time to record an album of classic rock hits, he mustered up his strength and traveled to the land down under. And the result was Tiny Tim Rock. They say that it's only when you throw a man into the deep end that you see what he is really made of. And that is certainly what Tiny Tim has done here. Like, here's a man whose feet are firmly planted in the 1880s, and yet here he is, thrust into this modern sound that he does not understand. But yet he doesn't back off. He doesn't tone himself down. In fact, he turns it up to 11. Listening to Tiny Tim rock, you might very well think that he is crazy, out of touch, and out of his mind, but he is definitely not phoning it in. What we have here is essentially a rock covers album, but with such a brazen lack of appreciation for traditional rock music structure, it's almost more like a deconstruction of rock music itself. But it's not. Remember, Tiny is trying to score a hit record here. He is being 100% genuine in his attempt to create good, honest rock and roll, and that's what gives this album its edge. The choices being made on this album are so baffling and so contrary to the most basic of musical instincts that the end result is endlessly fascinating. Alright, let's get back on track. Let's go over all 5 tracks individually and break them down.
I'm on the highway to hell. I'm on the highway to hell.
Living easy, living free. Season ticket on a one-way ride.
Highway to Hell was recorded in 1983, and it's the track which inspired the album in the first place. It's the shortest song at just over 6 minutes, and it's probably the most sane song on the album. It starts off pretty unassuming with the classic Highway to Hell riff, but then Tiny chimes in with his dramatic baritone. A bit of an unexpected choice on the surface maybe, but it's not ill-fitting. It's a novel approach to the song and it fits Tiny's voice. His high notes are a bit rough, but if you listen to AC/DC on the regular, you're already quite used to that. Yeah, Tiny's vocals are actually pretty good on this one. He sings his lines with confidence, he is generally on pitch, his timing is alright. By the time the outro starts rolling, you feel pretty satisfied. Tiny Tim Rock has done exactly what it said on the tin. Except for one small detail, which is that the outro is 3 minutes long. That's right, we're not even halfway through the song. The Highway to Hell chorus is repeated for over 3 minutes. Unlike the original track, Tiny doesn't know when to stop. So he just keeps going and going, ramping up the intensity, just singing higher and higher notes until everything just turns into soup. And after 3 full long minutes of that, then the song ends. Just like that. Right, so that's Highway to Hell. That's the tamest song on the album.
The angel's smile is what you sell. You promised me heaven, then put me through hell.
This tiny interpretation of the Bon Jovi classic starts off with Tiny's dramatic baritone once again. First verse goes over pretty well, but then the chorus happens and Tiny immediately switches to goblin mode. Alright, allow me to go on a little tangent here, because the vocals on this album do put Tiny's vocal chops into question. So let's consider this. Is Tiny Tim a good singer? For what he's doing, I'd say yes. His tone is good, his pitch is generally solid, he has excellent control over his tremolo, but he has one major flaw, which is that he can't blend for the life of him. Now what I mean by blending is that he can belt high notes, and he can hit high notes in falsetto, but he has no means of blending those approaches together. So he ends up with a bit of a dead zone in his vocal range. Too high to sing with his normal voice, but also too low to hit confidently with his falsetto.
Which is why he's got that goblin tone going on.
This song also introduces another quirk, which is that Tiny is kind of functioning as the ringleader for these sessions, and he doesn't give a fuck where the band is at and will start phrases early or late at will. Tiny had always been difficult to accompany as a band, as his sense of timing is frankly incomprehensible. But on Tiny Tim Rock especially, he is completely out of it. For the whole runtime, it's like he's gunning to be as out of sync with the band as possible. Sometimes even actively working against the band, who is desperately trying to get him back on time. Anyway, they play for a bit, and then Tiny signals the band to enter freestyle mode, and he just starts spitting bars.
The name you give love is not in the dictionary, honey. The name you give love is somewhere else. Your break as long as you're secure in your safe.
The passage ends with Tiny getting shot.
You shot me. Shame on you.
And then the song ends. That's You Give Love a Bad Name.
Call 911.
This track is a medley of many classic rock and roll hits, some old, some newer. Now from the track list, you might get the impression that this track might have been planned out in some way. It's not. In fact, it's not even the real track list. Again, Tiny is basically the ringleader of this operation. He started off with a rendition of Great Balls of Fire.
You broke my wheel? Oh, what a thrill. Goodness gracious, great.
And from then on out, he just changes songs at will, and the band just has to deal with it. Sometimes he'll even cut off songs early and just switch to another song mid-phrase. Tiny's voice is pretty scrambled at this point too, with his falsetto being especially ripe. Tiny Tim actually held the world record for longest continuous singing medley, which is a record he set on multiple occasions, with his longest attempts going well over the 3-hour mark. Compared to that, this 16-minute marathon is nothing, but it's still impressive how throughout the entire track, he never stops singing. He never gives the band any room to breathe. He's just gobbling up all the space on this track. In fact, towards the end, the band has to essentially pull the plug to get Tiny to stop.
Rock and roll is here to stay. I dig it to the end. And you tell me over and over.
Eve of Destruction is a folk song written in 1964, with the most famous interpretation being that of Barry Maguire. Now, Barry's voice is a bit rough and run down, which works brilliantly in the context of the song, and could translate well into Tiny's vocal style. But there's two major problems to consider here. Number one, the song is about the Vietnam War, which Tiny was a big supporter of back in the day, which leads into problem number two. Tiny doesn't realize that the song is about the Vietnam War. Tiny instead interprets the song like a Batman villain, rejoicing over the upcoming eve of destruction. This was the last song recorded in the session, probably after a good few hours of rock and roll. The band's tired, Tiny's voice is in shreds, but they still want to put up a fight. Now, you might be wondering, how the hell do these bozos fill 23 minutes of disk space with an Eve of Destruction cover? Well, really, it's simple. You go verse, chorus, and when you're out of verses, you start from the first one again. Yeah, instead of going for the concentrated insanity of the previous tracks, this one seeks to grind you down through attrition.
With a world in a grave, take a look around your boy. It's bound to scare your boy, and you tell me.
This track really is an endurance round, maybe with the sole exception being Tiny's freestyle monologue 10 minutes in.
Ladies and gentlemen, another child, 6 years old, has just been thrown off the roof.
Tiny, what the fuck are you doing? But other than that, it really is an unchanging monolith. The band just keeps trucking the same chords, the same rhythm, the same intensity. Towards the end, you can even hear the band signaling to Tiny to wrap it up, but Tiny just keeps on going. He's dedicated to filling up the entire CD. But after almost 24 minutes, the song eventually dies down, and you are greeted with the loudest silence in music history. So yeah, that was Tiny Tim Rock. You know, it's truly a fascinating experience.
Psych!
You do Rebel Yell?
Well, now I'm learning.
Rebel Yell is really, it's Tiny Tim's crowning achievement. It truly showcases what Tiny Tim Rock is all about. Amongst all the songs on the album, this is definitely the one which Tiny knows the least. He's reading the lyrics from sheet music, he barely knows the melody, and is basically winging it through the entire 23-minute runtime. We start off with a goblin screech at the beginning, followed by verse 1, and already Tiny is sounding like a cartoon character.
Last night a little dancer came dancing to my door. Last night a little angel came pumping on the floor.
This is by far the most unhinged vocal on the album, with Tiny transposing the choruses to hell and back. That's 15 semitones higher than the Billy Idol original. Not bad for a 60-year-old man. Actually, you know what? Let's fully dissect this track, because the way this song is structured is insane. First, let me show you how the original Billy Idol version goes. It goes intro, verse, chorus, bridge, verse, chorus. Very common pop songwriting formula. Hundreds of thousands of songs are written this way. It's a very recognizable template. Now, this is how the Tiny Tim version goes. Intro, verse, chorus, and by verse 2, Tiny has already forgotten the melody and is performing it in a dramatic spoken word rendition.
She don't like slavery, she won't sit and beg. But when I'm tired and lonely, she sends me to bed.
The song then goes chorus, bridge, also spoken word, verse, chorus, and just like that, they've run out of source material. And yet, there's 20 minutes of the song left. So where does Tiny go? Well, the band starts vamping, just begging Tiny to signal what direction they want to go. They do this for a full minute before Tiny finally starts conjuring up some fighting words.
Strike, 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 fight, 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 strike, fight, strike, fight, fight.
He does this for a whole 2 minutes. Then we go to chorus, followed by another spoken word rendition of verse 2. Followed by another round of fighting words. Followed by a sort of deconstruction of the chorus, with Tiny just yelling more over and over. Then we cut to a didgeridoo spoken word rendition of verse 3.
I'll walk the wall with you, babe. 8,000 miles with you.
The song then goes chorus, 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 and we're not even halfway done. Then we get a dinky ass guitar solo before returning to verse 1. Dude's not even pretending he remembers the actual melody anymore. Then we go chorus, chorus, verse 2 for the third time, again, spoken word. Chorus, then this happens. I swear to God, verse 3 for the third time. Then we get a space rendition of the chorus. The song then gets completely deconstructed. "15 minutes in, Rebel Yell has been annihilated beyond repair. Until... That's right, bozo. It's verse 1 again. Cut to chorus, back to fighting words yet again for 1.5 minutes. Verse 2 for the 4th time, still spoken word, followed by chorus. Shout out to this mic feedback. Fighting words again. Tiny then starts to improvise a bit where he calls 911 to warn of a potential rebel congregation.
Police headquarters. Police headquarters. Rebel congregation for the main. All cars coming. 1, 2.
And the song goes chorus, chorus, back to the police headquarters bit.
Bring another car. A squad car. Over for the main.
I swear to God, chorus, chorus, fighting words again.
Once more.
Yeah, you said it, Tim. But as Tiny attempts to engage the chorus for the 21st time, the band finally steps in, resulting in this clusterfuck of a transition.
In the midnight hour. In the midnight hour. More.
Then we get this Scott Walker-esque venture back to chorus, which works surprisingly well. And then, after 23 intense minutes, the Rebel Yell finally gets put to rest.
When all is darkness.
Now that was Tiny Tim Rock.
Talking about at least 24 years, and without a hit record or a hit movie or anything. I mean, this is about the 25th comeback, you know, because every year since 1970, I've been coming back with something.
Tiny Tim Rock was not a huge commercial success, though it did alright by Tiny Tim standards. The album was originally released in Australia only, where it sold off all of its 1,000 copies. The reception of the album among traditional music critics was, maybe expectedly, quite poor.
That was really sad. He is a global brand in a state of decay, reduced to belting out what purports to be heavy metal music. He doesn't sing, he shouts into the microphone, in a total travesty of himself and the music he's trying to imitate.
That being said, fans of Tiny Tim generally felt very positively about the album. Granted, for Tiny, this was just another dead-end venture, and he would soon return home to his hotel room in Des Moines, Iowa.
Oh, hello, Mr. Foley?
Hey, Tiny, how are you?
I'm good, but I'll tell you what. I just got a letter from Mr. Charles Manson.
Really? What did it say?
It said something about how the 60s need to be kept alive, and I'm one of the only people doing anything to keep the 60s alive, but I need to do more.
What else did it say?
I don't know, I tore it up.
In a surprising twist of fate, Tiny Tim's career was on the uptick. This time, Tiny would see fame in an unlikely format. Radio. It started with his own local radio show, Tiny Tim's Tabloid Radio. Now that didn't really go anywhere, but one thing that did garner him quite a bit of fuzz were his many appearances on Howard Stern.
I say to Listerine, get back to glass, because the plastic is killing your mouthwash. I use Clean and Smooth germ-free dispenser. It's more sanitary for the hands. You press the top down.
That's just for washing your hands.
That's the rear end.
You're wearing a diaper right now?
It depends. Yeah.
No.
Because instead of underwear, I throw it away every day. It's nice and sanitary.
Go ahead.
They are getting the hemorrhoids from meats and cheeses.
So when you go to the supermarket, you will buy a hemorrhoid cream and apply it.
Yes. I don't have them anymore, and I still apply them.
Just as a precaution.
That's right.
Really? Is that right?
He even guest starred on Larry King's final radio broadcast. In the interview, the veteran talk show host asked Tiny where he thought his career was headed.
I want to get a hit record.
Tiny replied,
And I know I can be good in horror movies.
Tiny married his second wife, Miss Jan, at Halloween attraction Spooky World. This event was then live broadcasted to none other than The Tonight Show, this time starring Jay Leno.
You know, Bill, come on over here and... This whole thing looks like some bad Alice Cooper video.
For once, Tiny was actually gaining some momentum. He was headhunted for sitcom walk-ons, cameos, radio appearances, labels with cancelled Tiny Tim projects, dredged them up and released them. Tiny would continue his recording work, being introduced to producer Mark Robinson through G.G. Allen. Yes, that G.G. Allen.
Carnival of Excess, the great album by Mr. G.G. Allen.
They would go on to create Prisoner of Love, a tribute to Russ Columbo, which would end up being Tiny's favorite album of his. However, shortly thereafter, Tiny's health would worsen. He would get diagnosed with congestive heart failure and given at most 5 to 10 years to live. Nevertheless, he kept on performing, and he was even invited to the Ukulele Expo in Massachusetts in 1996.
If you hear any coughing during the show, well, it's because,
Right after walking on stage, Tiny Tim suffered a heart attack. This did not kill him.
Only one, I was more concerned over the playoff, which lifted the blood pressure more than anything else.
The doctor gave him at most 1 year left to live and forbade him from performing ever again.
When you think of people like Michael Landon dying way before his time, Elvis Presley, so many others who haven't seen a full life, it's a blessing to live this long without pain. If I live 10 years, it's a miracle. 5 years, it's even more of a miracle. Death is never polite, even when we expect it. The only thing I pray for is the strength to go out without complaining.
When asked if he had any regrets about his life, he only mentioned that he wished he had just a little more sex with his wife. Despite his prospects looking grim, Tiny was not one to listen to doctor's orders, and he continued to perform when his strength allowed it. He also resisted any dietary alterations, continuing to eat the same old foods and drinking the same old beers.
I really believe, this is my own opinion. Go ahead. That diabetes is not hampered by beer. Beer has brewer's yeast, and also is a great.
Good for the bowel or not?
Not bad.
On November 30th, while performing at a benefit dinner hosted by the Women's Club of Minneapolis, he was to perform a short 4-song set. However, in the middle of performing Tiptoe Through the Tulips, Tiny collapsed, and, as he had once predicted, died. Right there on stage. It's easy to see the story of Tiny Tim as a tragedy, a beloved underdog turned colossal one-hit wonder who spiraled out of control trying to claw his way back to the top. In fact, that's probably how Tiny would describe his own career.
Yes, Tiny Tim admits he's a has-been, but he's not giving up.
In reality, even during his highest peaks, his fame was quite volatile, fueled by equal parts admiration and disgust, with Tiny not being able to tell the difference. But really, for a man so devoted to the past, he was ahead of his time. And one of the saddest things about Tiny's death is that if he'd lived just for another 10 years, he'd probably find himself a consistent niche, a recognizable, easily understood character, someone who'd slot right in as a cameo on The Norm Show or the WWE without it being out of place.
That I am not a Burger King, right, Tiny Tim? Right. You're the Dairy Queen. Yes. What did you say? You're the Dairy Queen.
I think the 90s could have been a good decade for Tiny. Not only could he have gotten another taste of that sweet national fame, but I think he would also have gotten something he'd never really received from the general public before. Respect. It'd still be a punchline, but with a self-ironic tinge that he's in on the joke, able to make fun of himself while still staying true to who he is. If he had kept his health in check, I think we'd have seen a little Tiny Tim renaissance. Sadly, this is all hopeful speculation. But no matter what, Tiny still left behind a sizable musical legacy. Some good, some bad, and some absolutely transcendent. And what better to do with a musical legacy than to preserve it? As of the creation of this video, Tiny Tim Rock is not on any streaming platforms. It's not for sale on Discogs or eBay. The only place to listen to it now is on YouTube, which hosts a single upload of the album from 2015, which has gained a total of 12,000 views from the past 7 years. The album is essentially abandonware. only remembered by the most dedicated of Tiny Tim fans and the busiest of music nerds. Which is a shame, because there really is nothing like it. From a more objective perspective, this album is a complete mess. Just total auditory spaghetti. But as an experience, on its own bizarre terms, I sincerely think that it's highly worth your time. It won't sound like anything else you've ever heard in your life, and I wholeheartedly recommend checking it out, even if just for a song or two. And really, that's all I wanted to do with this video. To extend the lifetime of Tiny Tim's most ambitious, ill-conceived failure. In the end, I think it's what the man would have wanted. Thank you for watching.
Come, let us roam down Lover's Lane, once more to sing old love's refrain. Soon we must say, Auf Wiedersehen, Auf Wiedersehen, my dear. Here in your arms I can't remain, so let me kiss you once again. Soon we must say, Auf Wiedersehen, Auf Wiedersehen, my dear. Your love will cling to me through the lonely daytime. Each night will bring to me a precious memory of Maytime. I know my heart won't beat again until the day we meet again. Sweetheart, goodbye. Auf Wiedersehen, Auf Wiedersehen, my dear. Your love will cling to me through the lonely daytime. Each night will bring to me a precious memory of Maytime. I know my heart won't beat again until the day we meet again. Sweetheart, goodbye. Auf Wiedersehen, Auf Wiedersehen, my dear.